Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for turning out in such numbers despite the weather. It actually surprises us. We were half expecting to be speaking to an empty room and to online audiences only, but it's fantastic to have a good crowd in person with us today. Good evening. Welcome to the Sydney launch of the 2025 Lowy Institute Poll. I'm Hervé Lamayu, the Director of Research here at the Institute, and I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which the Institute stands as the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Ladies and gentlemen, when the Lowy Institute was established in 2003, it was given three missions: to inform the Australian debate, to contribute to Australian policy, and to project Australian voices abroad. The Lowy Institute Poll has long been central to each of those missions, and it's core to our DNA. The reason for that is quite simple. It's hard to inform the Australian debate, to contribute to policy, or to project Australian voices when you don't know what Australians actually think about the world. So throughout the poll's two-decade existence, the Lowy Institute has conducted rigorous and representative annual surveys of Australian views on the world they live in. Importantly, every year, we are sure to ask a number of the same tracking questions so we can develop longitudinal data and see how Australian views on important topics change over time. And the author of this year's poll, Ryan Neelam, a friend and colleague, has done a wonderful job, if I may say so, at capturing the moment. 2025 has been a very tumultuous year, and we're only halfway through. And I think it's quite humbling. The poll is a humbling reminder that Australians are highly aware of the world around them. Feelings of safety and economic optimism have both fallen back to COVID-era record lows. Australians know, I think, deep down, that the brakes are off the wheels of history and that we are heading downhill and picking up pace. But then again, you gain an appreciation for how calibrated responses are to this very fluid moment. For example, global disorder appears to have helped to restore trust in our system of government. 3/4 of Australians say democracy is preferable to any other kind of government, and that is a record high with 2022. So often the results may seem contradictory, but give them a bit of time, a bit of space, analyze them properly, and I think you view them as quite wise. Another example. Just over a third of Australians say they trust the United States to act responsibly in the world since Donald Trump was re-elected. Yet 80% think it's important that we stick with the US alliance. Perhaps that's a recognition as well that there are very few alternatives available to us. And perhaps as well, if you read it another way, Australians are making a distinction between the man in the Oval Office and the institution of the alliance, which predates him and will hopefully survive him. But it goes to show that making sense of the poll, reading between the lines, is as important and significant a task as meticulously recording the data. We do both at the Institute, and for that reason we've assembled a distinguished panel of experts this evening to help break down what we should take away from the results this year. So with that, let me pass to the ABC's Isabella Higgins to introduce this evening's esteemed panel and lead the discussion. Can I warmly welcome the panelists to the stage? Thank you.
Everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. As you heard, I'm an ABC News journalist, so I'm most familiar with the Lowy Institute for calling them up and saying, "Hi, we've got a news story, need you to talk again." Ryan's helped me out on a few occasions. At the moment, I'm the social affairs reporter for ABC, but I've just got back from a 3.5-year posting in London. Quite an eventful few years covering the Ukraine war, the fallout of the UK leaving the European Union. We'll get into some of those topics in this. And also, I want to say I'm a proud Torres Strait Islander, so I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on whom we meet tonight, the Gadigal people. I'll now introduce our wonderful panel. We're going to get into a range of topics tonight: the US, China, Ukraine, defence spending, and I think we've got a great group of people to break down the findings of this report and also just give us some more insights. Next to me, I have the New South Wales Senator Dave Sharma. Thank you for being here. Susannah Patton, the head of the Southeast Asia program here at the Lowy Institute, and of course, Ryan Neelam, the author of this report, and as I said, someone who's helped me out several times when I have been busy on deadline reporting duties. So thank you. It's great to be here. I think the first place we might start is that US-sized shaped elephant in the room. Some interesting findings this year in the report. Perhaps not surprising that Australians' trust is dropping in the US, but Ryan, I'd like to go to you first. Are you surprised by how much trust has dropped in the US?
Yes, and thanks Isabella and the other panellists for being here. I also just, before I get started, want to say thank you to my colleagues who have, you know, my name's on the cover, but this is really a whole of institute effort from the questions we ask, where everybody feeds into the analysis and the reporting and the write-ups of what comes out of the poll. So thank you to everybody. But yes, look, there were two big surprises when it came to attitudes towards the United States. The first was that magnitude of the drop in trust. It was a 20-point decline, as Hervé said, from last year, now that Donald Trump's in the White House, with only 36% of Australians saying they trust the United States to act responsibly in the world. When you look at distrust, it's almost two-thirds of Australians say they have little to no trust in the United States. So it's a really stark difference, and we're in uncharted waters here when it comes to the way that Australians see the United States and the amount of trust they hold towards them. But the second surprise for me was when I looked at this question that we've asked since the start of the poll 2 decades ago, which is how important is the alliance to Australia's security? And as Hervé mentioned in the introduction, there really wasn't much change there. It was a stable result. 8 in 10 Australians say that the US continues to be important to our security. So it speaks to that ability of Australians to hold two things in their minds at the same time, for them to have an appreciation for both the different direction that Trump is clearly taking the United States, as well as the role that the institution of the alliance plays in our security.
And Susannah or Dave, I wonder if you have any observations.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Ryan has said, and there are other results that also speak to that. So, I mean, it's really interesting to me that the number of Australians who are confident that the US will come to defend Australia if Australia were under attack has actually gone down by a sizable about 10% compared with when a similar question was asked in previous years. So that's quite a striking finding. Also, that Australians have roughly about the same, when the question was asked about who do you trust to do the right thing in world affairs between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, actually comes out quite evenly. So people are obviously very seized of the fact that the United States has changed and that Australia is going to need to respond to that in some way. But given that we have a sort of broader public and intellectual debate in Australia that goes to the idea of do we need a plan B, or, you know, how can we sort of move beyond the alliance in some quarters, it's very clear that for Australians the alliance is still going to be part of the mix. It's just a question of how do we work with this new United States, which is presenting such a different face to the world.
And Senator?
Yeah, I think it's Australians drawing a distinction between the United States, its institutions and its government, and a leader that they don't particularly like, and I think they can draw a distinction there. And it's notable to me, I mean, look, Australians generally favour Democrat administrations. If you go back, the George W. Bush administration was quite unpopular in Australia on a comparable level with Trump's first term. The Barack Obama administration was quite popular. So, you know, naturally speaking, I think the country here leans democratic. But I think those second order figures about, you know, the importance of the alliance, expectations about the US coming to our assistance suggest that we recognise that the occupant of the Oval Office is temporary, but parts of the alliance and the fabric of the alliance, those are more enduring.
I think we've got a figure here that 89% of Australians disapprove of Trump's policies, which is quite interesting, 89%.
Of his desire to acquire Greenland, I think that was...
Oh, is that...
Yeah,
that was the least popular policy, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, and then...
But quite pro-Greenland in Australia.
Yeah. But it's majority disapproval of almost every policy we tested on Trump's foreign policies, except for defence spending, his pressure on allies to spend more on defence, and that was about evenly split.
And I think if we look at recent events in the news, Australia's come out supportive of US strikes in Iran. I wanted to ask you, Susannah, what do you think the rest of the world, the non-English speaking world, makes of Australia and its support of America at a time like this?
I mean, I look a lot at Southeast Asia, and I think actually, you know, it's a really interesting contrast with Australia, because I think Australians have tended to be more sentimental about the United States and have tended, you know, at times it's kind of ebbed and flowed, but often there's been more of a narrative in Australia that this is a relationship that is built on shared values and on the idea of mateship and so on. Whereas the countries that I focus on a lot in Southeast Asia, they've always actually seen the US as being a very transactional power that will exercise power as a great power in the way that it sees to be appropriate. And so for them, I think actually this moment in history, maybe more broadly than just the Iran strikes, but this moment in history, I think they see it as plus ça change, right? That the US has always been like this, and it's going to continue to exercise power in this way. And I think for us in Australia, it's a much more profound shock in many ways. And I mean, I think the Iran strikes that you mentioned, I think it's a challenge for Australia, because it also goes to the question around the decline of the rules-based order, the weakening globally of the norm of the prohibition on the use of force in international relations. And so in many ways, that's one of the reasons why this moment in history is particularly challenging for Australia, because not only is the US alliance in question with a more unpredictable transactional administration, but simultaneously we've got the decline of the multilateral system and some of the underpinning principles. And so those two things, I think, for a country like Australia, which is a middle power, which has always really leaned into multilateralism as one of the legs of our foreign policy, makes this a really profoundly kind of challenging moment.
And I know we don't have specific data on this in this report, Ryan, about how Australia feels at this time backing the US on these recent strikes. But what do you sort of draw on how Australians feel about the state of the Australia-US alliance and specifically what we've seen in recent weeks?
Yeah, so I mean, it's important to timestamp. This whole poll was taken, it was in the field in early March, so the first couple of weeks of March. And just to give a bit of context around what was happening, because that's useful on what was present in Australians' minds when they were asking these questions, was there was one, the recent live fire drills of the Chinese Navy in the Tasman Sea, and then its circumnavigation of Australia. Two, just before we went to field, there was that, for want of a better word, spectacle of an Oval Office meeting between Trump and Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. So that would have been fresh in Australians' minds that, wow, this is really a different approach of a US president and upends many norms. And then there was his tariff policy had already been on again, off again, pre-Liberation Day. There was war in the Middle East, war in Ukraine. And I think when you look at the collection of these results overall, it speaks to a real uncertainty about where we are. It's sort of, we're now in, uncharted waters across the board. We, as Susannah said, there's a sense that the rules that we've depended on for our prosperity and for our security are breaking down. And I think, obviously I can't speak to what the Australians think about the Iran strikes, but in several parts of the poll, we do see Australians leading in to support aspects of the rules-based order that we've benefited from. One of those you mentioned is Greenland, the idea that Trump is trying to pressure Denmark to take Greenland. He hasn't ruled out the use of force. I think part of the reason why there's such strong disapproval is because Australians recognise that this is contrary to international norms, particularly if you use force to expand territorially. But also the idea that Trump has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement on climate change, his withdrawal from the World Health Organization. These are things which Australians lean towards cooperation to address global challenges. I mean, on the Iran strikes, this is my view, but I think few Western observers would quarrel with the objectives there, which is to defang the Iranian regime and to remove its ability to acquire nuclear weapons, but it's how you do that. And I completely agree with Susannah. I mean, I think when you start to erode the norms against the use of force, that's not just an issue of how we deal with Iran, but it's also how we deal with Russia and how we deal with China. And there are implications we have to think about as a country that stands up for the rules-based order, is what does that mean when the shoe's on the other foot and we're dealing with countries like China potentially looking to retake Taiwan in the future.
And Senator Sharma, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on some of those things Ryan was just talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I'd hesitate, no one wants to have a go here, but I'd hazard a guess and say that there was majority support in Australia for the US action against Iran. I mean, if you look at Iran, sort of like the second most disliked country, according to Australians, it's slightly above North Korea. It was a limited military operation. I mean, the United States has not invaded another country. It was a limited military operation with clear military objectives to dismantle a clear threat. I mean, I was reading something by David Brooks in the New York Times just earlier today. I think that the headline of the story was, "I detest Netanyahu, but on some things he's actually right." And I think a lot of people have a bit of a difficulty in seeing through their dislike of Trump or of Netanyahu, including large parts of the Democratic US Foreign Policy Administration. So they sort of have this immediate instinctive reaction that everything they do must be wrong and evil. And I think you need to assess these things on their merits. I mean, the same article that David Brooks talks about, he says, I often see lawn signs saying war is not the answer. Well, on this occasion, war was the answer. And I think I have a concern about the fraying of the rules-based order, but I also have a concern about our naivety, thinking that we alone are going to be able to save the rules-based order, or that it's not already dead. I mean, your executive summary, or Michael's introduction to this, talks about him giving the Boyer lectures 10 years ago, when he talks about Dean Acheson saying his book, Present at the Creation of the post-World War II order. And Michael's title of his talk, so he talks about being present at the destruction. So here's someone talking about the destruction of the rules-based order 10 years ago. I think we need to recognise that it's not dead, but it's not in good health.
I think your colleague Andrew Hastie came out and said, if you believe in the rules-based order at this time, you're living in a fanciful land. Do you feel similarly?
Well, I think it feels a bit like, we're in the League of Nations and, Japan's occupied Manchuria and Italy's invaded Abyssinia, but we're all saying, but look, the League of Nations has got to meet and deal with this. I'd love to see it alive and kicking in good health, but I think we need to be realistic that force is going to be increasingly used as part of the tools of statecraft, as it has been traditionally. That's not a great thing. I'm not applauding that, but I think we need to be, we need to recognise that fact.
Mm-hmm. I don't disagree that the rules-based order is under serious assault here, and I think part of the issue is that, and what's so difficult for Australians to come to grips with, is that part of that reason why it's under assault is not just the revisionist powers of Russia and China trying to change the way it works, but the US now is actually upending some of those rules. But I think we have to be careful not to let this be a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And to recognise that it's not going to be us alone that will save aspects of the rules-based order, but if we work together with other like-minded liberal democracies, there are really important rules at stake there that we need to stand up for. And that's not a foregone conclusion. I think we should be pretty clear about what we can do working with other partners to try and preserve aspects of it. I don't disagree that we're probably facing a different state of the world order now.
And Susannah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. If leaders in Australia are talking about the rules-based order being over, do you think it takes away Australia's credibility to operate in places like the Pacific?
I think it takes away one of Australia's ways of working internationally, which has been really important to us. Like if you think about some of Australia's big diplomatic achievements or legacies that we look back on, things like the establishment of APEC, for example, or building inclusive regional institutions, are some of what I think many people would say are among Australia's big achievements. And it's because they're the kind of things that you can do as a country of our size, working with others. But it's clear now that that's going to be so much more difficult because of the polarisation. I mean, last year we had a G20 where all the leaders couldn't even get in a group photo, let alone have a joint statement. So we are in a really different environment, and I think it's one where bilateral relationships with the major powers are going to be much more, I mean, they've always been, I guess, central, but I think now they're going to have even greater importance. And of course, then, you know, when those individual bilateral relationships become difficult, like we have now with the US and we've had for some time with China, then it's something that's even more difficult for Prime Ministers to manage, I think.
And on that idea of changing powers, Ryan, could you maybe just fill everyone in on what some of the findings were on China and Australia's view on China?
Yeah, so I mean, this has been one of the real paradigm shifts over the 2 decades of the poll, is how Australians look at China. When we started polling, Australians were on the whole optimistic about China's rise. We saw benefit and opportunity in the economic linkages we have with China. The inflection point really started around 2018, 2019, gathered pace. That's around the time we started having a debate about foreign interference in Australia, and use of foreign technology. The Huawei issue came to the fore around that time. And then 2020 was when we really hit rough waters. There was the call for an independent inquiry into COVID. There was Hong Kong happening at that time as well, and human rights abuses in Xinjiang. The Australian government had been vocal about all of those things, and that's when China reacted by putting $20 billion worth of trade blockages on Australia. So that's when Australians really started to have this recalibration. Well, recalibration is probably too light a word. It's a real paradigm shift. You can see this question we ask: do you see China as more of an economic partner or as more of a security threat? And what we saw during the COVID years is the number of people who saw it more through the lens of security threat soared up to almost 2/3 of the public. Since the Albanese government came into office and brought in what they call the policy of stabilisation with China, we've started to see those threat perceptions start to mellow. And I don't want to overstate it because it is incremental in most of the questions we ask. But today, where we are on that question is it's about evenly split between the number who see China as more of an economic partner or more of a security threat. So again, you're seeing a bit of a divide in the population on those views. But when it comes to trust, only 1/5 of the population trust China to act responsibly. That's below where the US is, by the way. And when it comes to threat perceptions, 69% of Australians say that China is likely to be a military threat to Australia in the next 2 decades. So that's a still really high number. Mm-hmm. So it is, we're still in that frame of a new way of looking at China.
And Susannah, what do we know about how our neighbours in the region feel about the changing power dynamics between superpowers like the US and China?
I mean, I think just to add to what Ryan said, I mean, the other really interesting thing to me about the way that Australians view China is I think there was a question there about sort of the emphasis in Australian policy. Should it be more about trying to deter China versus trying to cooperate with China? And again, there's a sort of about a 60% group of people who, who say that the emphasis should be on working with allies to deter China. So I think there is a really sort of, I would say, like across all those questions, a solid group of about 60% of people who've got a pretty robust attitude towards pushing back on China and who appreciate that it's not going to be the same kind of cooperative partnership now as it was in the past. And of course that is different to where some of our neighbours are, where they see much more emphasis on cooperation. And so that's something that Australia needs to manage in its regional relationships as well.
And Senator, what do you see as the greatest challenge for Australian governments moving forward in managing that relationship with China?
I think what struck me in the poll was that if you ask the question, Ryan will correct me if I've got it wrong here, which country do you expect to be the most powerful actor in 10 years' time? The majority of Australians say China rather than the United States by a significant margin. And which country do you expect to have the most technological capabilities, I think is the question, right? Again, people say China by a 2-to-1 margin. So Australians seem to have a sense that, China's rise is kind of inevitable and it will supplant the United States. Rightly or wrongly, I disagree with that judgment, but a majority of Australians obviously have that. But at the same time, they are wanting their government to adopt policies that basically hedge or contain or strengthen us against that risk. So it's quite an interesting kind of dichotomy that they accept China's going to be the most powerful actor with an impact on our interests, but they're not prepared to make terms with it, or come to terms with it, or reach some sort of accommodation. So it shows quite an independently minded streak as well.
Yeah, could I just add to that? I mean, I'm glad you picked up on that, Dave, because it's fascinating, I think, that you still have these, on the whole, high threat perceptions of China, but this almost assumption that China will eclipse the United States in the next decade. So, I mean, the policies question that Susannah touched on, when we ask what should we be doing more of with China, it's much more weighted towards deterrence and pressuring China on human rights. It's about, the largest share of Australians say that we should continue trading at about the same level, and then on investment, about half the population say we should attract less investment from China. So on economic issues, a sort of much less emphasis than on the pressure and deterrence, which is interesting. But I think part of what that shows is that people think we should be doing a number of things at the same time. And climate, I might mention, half the population say we should cooperate more on climate change. So, with these big superpowers, these multifaceted relationships, I think it's useful to understand that the public here are grappling with multiple things, and actually they can look at a country like China and say, okay, we see threats, we see the need for deterrence, but we also see the need to engage on climate, on global problems, on economic issues.
Another big conversation that's been going on in Australia, but also around the world, on defence spending. We've just had the NATO summit last week where NATO members agreed to increase their defence spending to 5%, 3.5% on soldiers, hardware, and about 1.5% on military adjacent spending. So things like highways, cybersecurity, improving hospitals. The conversation's been going on for in Australia, lots of pressure on the Albanese government to boost our current defence spend. This poll suggests that Australians are certainly open to that. Tell us about that, Ryan.
Yeah, so again, in March, when we took this reading, half the population said that they support increasing defence spending, and 37% said we should keep it about the same. A very small minority, only 10%, say we should be spending less on defence. So it's almost the accepted logic that we need to be spending on defence at about the same or more. And the question is how much. We don't cover that in this poll. Just for a bit of context as well, when we went to field, we hadn't seen that meeting between Richard Marles and Pete Hegseth, where Hegseth stipulated a 3.5% target for Australia. But we had seen some pressure from the US administration. Elbridge Colby, I think, had said that defence spending was one of the major issues for the alliance. So that was reported here.
A question of how much, but also on what. Exactly. And Senator, what do you think the defence budget should be spending money on that it's not at the moment?
Well, kind of everything. I mean, we've got a capability problem, like our surface fleet's about down to 25 ships. It's the smallest it's ever been in the post-war era. We've got a huge problem with sort of retention and recruitment within the ADF. We need to spend more on the headquarters of what will be hosting the AUKUS submarines in the east and the west, and the shipyards and the port facilities to service and maintain and build them. So, I mean, and then I'd say, look, I think what the last few conflicts have taught us is the critical importance of unmanned systems. And we don't have, combat drones in Australia. We've got surveillance drones, but we don't have combat drones. We don't have and for a country like us with a small population defending a large territory in massive sea areas, that will always struggle to have a big defence force in absolute terms. We need the sort of force multiplier effect of those sorts of platforms. The challenge we've got, and this is not any great insight, is that the AUKUS spending is kind of cannibalising the other three services at the moment, and critical capability decisions in Army, Navy and Air Force are being put off to fund AUKUS because there's not enough in the defence budget to pay for AUKUS, maintain the existing services and make sure that they remain compatible with the sort of threats we face. So it's reassuring to hear, I think, Australians broadly support this. The difficulty is, and it would be difficult for any government, well, what are you going to cut to pay for it, or how much more are you going to tax us to pay for it? And that's the sort of fiscal straitjacket the government's in. And if we were in government, we would be having to grapple with that same decision too. And I'm not sure how much public support there would be if you say, well, we're putting 10 billion extra into defence and this is what's coming from childcare or aged care or whatever it might be.
And is AUKUS the way forward?
I think so. I mean, the figures are, well, look, I certainly believe it. I think the public, Ryan, I think it's about 2/3 of people support us acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, which has been quite a stable figure. And given how much it's in the news, and there's always stuff that's concerning if you follow this in the news, that it's taking longer, or the US might not agree, or they're doing an AUKUS review now in the Pentagon.
Or it's all going to be delayed, or we might never get the subs.
Yeah, so I think Australians seem to think that it is the right thing, and I certainly do. I just think given our, the reason it's the right thing for my mind is because the unique features of our strategic geography lend themselves incredibly well to nuclear-powered submarines that can stay at sea for longer, loiter for longer, have higher speed, have much greater capability. I mean, running a sort of conventionally powered submarine to try and patrol all of our maritime stretches, it's fine if you're in the Mediterranean. It's a terrible idea if you're trying to cover the Pacific and Indian Oceans.
And what do you make of arguments that some people say the AUKUS agreement compromises Australia's sovereignty?
I don't agree, but I mean, I would say that, to the extent the alliance, people could make that argument about any feature of the alliance. Like we host, and have hosted for many years, Pine Gap. We host other, US intelligence and detection capabilities. We have always been part of US military planning, and the truth is, in any contingency in the Indo-Pacific, it's very likely that Australia and the United States would be cooperating closely together, military or other terms. So, if you want to have no impediments whatsoever on our sovereignty, then we would be spending 7 to 8% of GDP on defence. Is the honest truth, and then we probably wouldn't have a very good defence force either, because we wouldn't be able to build the capability. So I think the alliance is fundamentally in our interests. But does it mean we need to take into account more considerations when dealing with a contingency than we would if we're operating alone? Yes, but I think on balance it's still the right thing for us to be doing.
And Susannah, do you think our neighbours in the region are paying much attention to how much Australia is spending on defence?
Can I just pick up on the point? I'm just interested to come in on the point around sort of what the defence spend is for, because I think that's also just important context in the, the figure of around half of Australians being open to increased defence spending is quite interesting to me, because the difference here between here and in Europe, where they've made this sort of very ambitious commitment of 5%, is that Europe is already at war, and the threat is very apparent in terms of Russia and the need to respond to that. Whereas here in Australia, I think there's a greater need for us for politicians to talk more about what the challenges are that we face, because it's not actually as simple as the threat of invasion. I don't think anyone's talking about Australia being invaded by China, but what we are talking about is a situation, and this is what's set out in the Defence Strategic Review, that Australia could be cut off from its trading partners, cut off from fuel supplies. And so this kind of scenario is much more difficult, both diplomatically, but also just in terms of communicating how Australia needs to be positioned to respond to that. And I think that's just something that has been missing in terms of the conversation around defence spending, is that, you know, what comes before the need to spend more is what is the threat environment, and what are the likely scenarios that we're going to face.
That's that's difficult though as an elected representative, because the truth is, I mean, we all speak in euphemisms. Anyone in government speaks in euphemisms about even, like, you know, the Defence Strategic Review. Because if you're seen to be demonising one country or saying that they are the source of threats, and we all know which is the most obvious country that is, you one, accused of kind of, you know, stoking fear or hysteria in Australia, or two, making a significant community of Australians feel uncomfortable in their country. It's quite a difficult conversation to have, having sort of tried to conduct it, and it's why I think we are less direct than perhaps we should be. I mean, you know, there's no political price. I mean, maybe if you're in Germany there is, but in Europe for demonising Russia, right? Everyone can talk quite openly about it. But I mean, we would pay an economic price and a trading price, but also a kind of domestic social cohesion price if we kept finding ourselves at rhetorical loggerheads with the People's Republic of China.
So what can be done then by governments to fix that problem?
Well, I think we've just got to keep speaking subtly and hoping people understand what we're saying. And I think, I mean, if you look at the polling, I think people do. I mean, but it's probably been helped less by our rhetoric and more by the reality people have seen around them. I mean, yes, we have a more constructive, or less combative, I'd say anyway, diplomatic dialogue with China now. But, you know, they're still sort of sonar pulsing our Navy divers and conducting a circumnavigation using the PLA Navy and conducting live fire exercises. And Australians see all that and think, wow, this is pretty full on, right? And I think that's what's changed their opinion. And I think, you know, that's in many respects made our job a little easier than having to go out and sort of explain what would a contingency over Taiwan look like, or, you know, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think China is almost doing some of that work for the government, but I think it comes down to how our elected representatives talk about that threat, and making that distinction between the Communist Party of China and the government of China from China as a country, the Chinese people, is important, and I think that sort of distinction hasn't been as clear in the past, or at least it hasn't seemed like that from the Chinese community perspective. But also, I mean, there's the difference between talking about the behaviours and the country itself. So obviously, I think you've made this point before, Susannah, is that we have, and Penny Wong has, that there are behaviours we can take issue with, and we should be taking issue with the sonar pulsing of Navy divers, dangerous behaviour in the skies. We can take issue with China sending us a message and circumnavigating Australia, live fire drills in the Tasman Sea. But we should be able to have a mature conversation about those things, particularly when so much is at stake when it comes to our budget and how we frame our debate about how we defend Australia.
And Susannah, did you have any observations or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think it's about pointing to the behaviours that are concerning, whether it be the PLA military modernisation or aspects of China's coercive behaviour to its neighbours. And I'm not saying that, of course, any government should be out there tanking the bilateral relationship or deliberately going out of its way to antagonise China. I think there's a balance to be struck, but at the same time, if at some point a government wants to significantly raise defence spending, then there does need to be a conversation that people can understand about what are the threats and how does Australia need to respond.
I don't think we've got time to get into this, but an interesting point I think, to raise if anyone wants to ask questions later. Were the findings 71% of Australians back Australians participating in peacekeeping forces? Maybe going to that point about the threats Australians do understand and the ones we don't. I wanted to move the conversation to some of the findings around Australia's energy mix, conversations around net zero, renewables, where we get our power from, never going away. Ryan, I wonder if you can just quickly recap some of those findings.
Okay, so at a headline level, we asked this tracking question on how urgently do Australians see the issue of climate change, and should we be taking steps that involve costs? And this year there's been a bit of a softening, 6% drop in the number of Australians who say climate change is a really urgent issue that we should be acting on even if it involves costs. So half the population now take that view. When it comes to particular technologies, what we've seen in a number of questions over multiple years is a very strong level of support for renewables, particularly subsidising renewables. 82% this year say that we should be subsidising renewable technology. And in the energy mix, renewables is by far the most supported energy policy, though I should note when we look at coal, gas and nuclear, there are also majorities of Australians saying that those should be part of the mix. So there's obviously some texture there when it comes to the election debate over how we should structure our energy mix in the future. If you look at the result as a referendum on energy, then I think it's hard to avoid the conclusion that the public have rejected nuclear as part of our 2050 mix. But interestingly, what we see here is that people are in principle open to that as a technology.
I might ask you, Senator, obviously a big conversation in your party about what the stance is on nuclear moving forward.
Not resolved yet.
When you see those numbers though, what's your personal stance?
Well, I guess I see it as, so the interesting thing that the lesson I took from this is that Australians are quite pragmatic about our energy policies and not strongly ideological. So they do support reducing emissions, but as Ryan said, I mean, 2/3 of Australians think we will still be using gas and coal and probably nuclear by 2050, right? That's hard to square that unless we get, direct air capture technologies happening at scale or carbon capture and storage. It's hard to square that with actually hitting net zero by 2050 if you're using gas and coal, and at least gas and coal. About 1/3 of Australians think net zero is going to make us worse off. About 1/3 think it's going to be an opportunity, I think, Ryan, and the rest sort of have no difference. So my sense is people think we need to be heading in this direction, but they're not too fixated about quite how we do it. They're not sort of anti-fossil fuels or strongly anti-fossil fuels. They would like to see fossil fuels play a less prominent role and renewables play a more prominent role. But I don't see them, as I said, I think the direction of travel is clear for them, but the speed of travel is kind of negotiable with the Australian public, which that's sort of my view personally. Whether that view will prevail.
And no personal view on whether nuclear should be part of that mix.
I'm agnostic. I mean, I think if nuclear makes commercial sense and private capital is prepared to build it and operate it, private capital.
At this time looks like it's not.
Well, I mean, because there's a legislative prohibition on it, no private capital could legally. But I would like to see that it's available as part of the energy mix. And I suspect, I mean, yes, the debate was had and lost from our side at the recent election. But, I think in 3 to 6 years' time, if smaller modular nuclear reactors are seen to be feasible, if the rest of the world continues to seem to embrace nuclear technology, I think inevitably we will revisit it in Australia, regardless of who's in government. I think it will be seen as a sort of a necessary part of the mix. And, public attitudes, I mean, the polling that I'd seen around nuclear suggests quite a strong generational difference in opinion towards nuclear. Like, older people tend to be more hostile to it. Younger people seem to be more open to it, which I think kind of reflects the
those who lived through
the
nuclear
Cold
disasters.
War and exactly. Yeah.
Well, we're going to open up questions to the floor. You can ask about anything in the report, anything we've touched on. Oh, we've already got some keen participants. We love that. Do you just want to stand up, tell us who you are, and if there's anyone specifically who you'd like to answer the question?
Sure. Randall Pierce, and I think this question is probably for Ryan. So Robert Putnam, the Harvard professor, has written Bowling Alone and recently Uprise. He aggregates a huge number of polls to create sort of a longitudinal view, and he says that people don't change their minds on key issues, but we change the people we ask the questions of as older generations die off and new generations rise up. Just wondering, you don't have age breaks in the poll in the booklet, from what I can see in a quick glance. Just wondering, what is the poll this year telling you about the worldview of young Australians?
Yeah, great question, thank you. We do include some of the age breaks in the narrative in the booklet, but if you go on the interactive website, this is a good plug for it actually, anybody can look at the different demographic splits on any of these questions. So if you want to know how political leaning, age, gender plays a role or changes those responses, there's really a lot of difference there. So your question was about young people and how they see the world. So I think on questions like climate change, young people are much more forward-leaning in terms of the urgency that they see on that issue. I didn't mention before that 7 in 10 Australians also are very supportive of holding a COP in Australia, the UN Climate Summit, and again, younger people more supportive of that. Younger people are less optimistic about the economy, so that figure that we talked about before, where it's an all-time low in the history of our poll on economic optimism, well, younger people are much more pessimistic about their economic prospects. On defence spending as well, we see there's an age difference. Sorry, on the question of nuclear-powered submarines, I think it was younger people less favourable, but the biggest indicator of how people answer that question is actually politics, which way they lean on the spectrum. So there's a range in all of this differences. Sorry, one final point, because this is quite a stark split that's been there the whole time we've been asking the question on democracy. So Hervé mentioned at the start that 3/4 of the public, a record high, say that democracy is preferable to any other form of government. Interestingly, less young people take that view, so a lower level of support for democracy amongst youth than older age brackets. And there's plenty of interpretations of that age difference there.
Anyone else with questions?
Thank you, Ben Crowther. There was a mention of Plan B around what the options could be. And I think that there are signals that whilst previously there may not have been any risk with the relationship with the US, that at least we may have considered that there is a risk is plausible. I guess the question, and I think in the thermometer graph here, I think that the feelings thermometer with the UK has actually increased quite significantly from 2007 to now. I guess my question is there a renewed interest in the role of the Commonwealth and the United Kingdom, and perhaps as a potential for Plan B?
Do you want to have a crack, Susannah?
Yeah,
Well, I mean, I think Australians are always very positive about the UK. We like the UK, and I think there has been a bit of a strand of thinking, maybe going back around sort of 10 years, that not just the UK but other European countries would play a greater role in Europe, and in some ways AUKUS is part of that thinking, the idea that the UK has Indo-Pacific interests and it can provide an anchor point for them. Personally, I'm fairly sceptical about that, because obviously the Europeans have a lot on their hands in Europe, and so the idea they're really going to play a more substantial role that would drive greater alignment with Australia, to me just doesn't seem that realistic. That's my own sort of personal, more downbeat view, but others may think differently.
Oh, I would also add the UK's been in a pretty difficult financial situation for a long time, not in a great position, a lot of domestic issues at home. Not that those things don't exist in the US, but the scale of them in the UK are pretty profound at the moment. Anyone else?
I was just reading the vested interest, Australia's vested interest. When we talk about categorising what is Australia's vested interest, do you think Australians prioritise like morality, economy, security, cultural ties? Like, what do you think the general consensus is in Australia for what is most important?
Ryan, you might be the best one to answer that.
I'll have a crack. I think you're talking about Australia's vital interests, or the question of threats to those vital interests.
Oh yeah, okay.
Look, I mean, I think this really depends on which aspect you look at. But one thing I would point out is that across different questions, you see Australians, their sort of values and their sort of openness shining through. So you see that in the strong disapproval ratings of Trump's pulling back from the international system. You see it in the 7 in 10 Australians who say that we should be hosting a climate summit. You also see it in strong backing for Ukraine, and the statistic on, I think, 71% on supporting a potential UN peacekeeping mission in Ukraine. So I think that's one sort of strand across multiple results there, that Australians on the whole lean towards openness and international cooperation to deal with these issues. But then there's also real pragmatism in other aspects. I mean, even though we don't trust Donald Trump on the whole, most Australians think that we should be working with the US alliance, and that it plays an important role in our deterrence of aggression in the region. And I think likewise with China, you know, most people think that we should continue to trade with China even though they see threat there. So I think it's an interplay between principles and interests, and Australians are clearly capable of having both things in their minds and as a priority.
Probably got time for a couple more. Oh, who's up the back?
Hello, Max Broad from the Lowy Institute. This statistic of 71% support for a peacekeeping mission to Ukraine has been brought up a few times. Ahead of the last election, Peter Dutton was opposed to that suggestion. Senator Sharma, do you have a view on that topic?
Yeah, I think it was wrong to be opposed to it. I think I said as much at the time. I've said, my view was we shouldn't be ruling it in, but we shouldn't be ruling it out. I think it was premature for Anthony Albanese to commit to a peacekeeping force before there was such a thing. And before a ceasefire was reached. So I'm, comfortable with being critical of that, but I don't think we should rule out participating in one, and I still don't. I mean, that would be my view now, and I think that's, to the extent we've got a settled view on it, I think that would be the coalition's policy now, that if there is a ceasefire, and if another country was leading a peacekeeping operation, and if it was going to be in a, not in a hot conflict zone, but a peace monitoring type arrangement rather than a peace enforcement operation, then I think we should and we would be contributing. And I think, you see it in that figure. You also see there's pretty broad support in Australia for providing military assistance to Ukraine as well, about 3/4 as well. I think these are both, even though they're a long way from Australia and they're outside our traditional theatres, I think they're supporting Ukraine's survival is a vital national interest of Australia, and we should be doing more there.
Mm-hmm. Question down here.
Thanks. My question is for Senator Sharma. As a politician, I wanted you to reflect, seeing as you're in a very expansive mood and capable of saying things that you may not otherwise say.
It's a great privilege after an election loss. No one's paying too much attention to you. The need for discipline goes out the window. You can riff a bit more.
Great, we've got a few more questions there. Yeah.
Oh, we like that at the Institute. We appreciate that. Your relationship with polling. I mean, in two ways. As a politician, to what extent do you trust polling, other than, of course, the Lowy Institute, which is best in class, given that, on multiple occasions and potentially even the last election, the Liberal Party might have been burnt by some of its internal polling. And then a broader, I guess, more philosophical question, which is, as a politician, again, do you seek to shape public opinion, or do you follow it, and where do you draw the balance?
So I think, look, polling is quite, I mean, politicians who say they don't pay attention to the polls are not telling you the truth. They do watch it quite closely, like, you know, the published polls, the, you know, news polls and, you know, Resolve polls and YouGov polls and whatnot. And we were, like, the truth is, you know, we had a terrible intelligence failure in the last campaign. Like, you know, we were misled by a level of electoral appeal, if you like, which I think meant that we probably made judgments we wouldn't have reached if we knew in a different position. We possibly, you know, made some decisions about issues to campaign on and issues to not campaign on, issues to release policy on and not, because I think we thought we were in a stronger position, honestly, going into the election than we were. So that did really compromise our electoral strategy. Now, it's unfair just to blame the pollster, and I'm also struck that you know, politicians also like to, they flatter themselves that they have a good sort of non-empirical feel for the mood. And look, none of my colleagues or me, but I'm much less experienced than many of them, sort of none of them were sort of screaming out saying the polling's all wrong, we're heading for a train wreck, right? So clearly we all missed something as well, I think, and I haven't figured out the answer to that. So look, polling is important. I think though, I think most politicians, certainly I hope I'm in this category, I mean, you're informed by polling and it helps you understand how to sort of market a policy and what levers or what touch points are likely to most appeal to the public. But it ultimately, you know, the policy itself or your position itself is informed by your own judgment and life experience. And there's many examples of issues where public opinion seems to be overwhelmingly in one direction, but once a campaign is conducted and an argument is prosecuted and people, you know, listen to those arguments, they reach a different conclusion. So, you know, I'm always of the view that polling should sort of inform tactics, but not strategy, if you like. Strategy should be set by, you know, ideology and belief and national interest and what you think is best for the country. But polling can help you understand, you know, who are the hardest target audiences to reach, or which demographics are you struggling with, or is one gender listening to this argument but not the other, or is one professional class listening to this argument and not the other? I think it's quite important for that. And I mean, this is, I think, you know, this poll would help, I think, inform, you know, how do we communicate things and where do we have how have we got a job of convincing Australians of some things. There's some things where we clearly don't need to do much more of a sell, like, you know, support to Ukraine. Well, that's pretty straightforward, you know. There's some areas where we do need to do a bit more of a sell. I mean, one figure that I found alarming in here was the support for manufacturing things in Australia, even if it's going to cost more. It was like vastly high, like 80%. And we have always, you know, our history has been a free trading nation. And if people knew how much more it would cost us to make things in Australia, some things, I think they would be alarmed. But that's obviously, you know, support for free trade is obviously quite soft in Australia right now. So I think it's sort of, you know, polling can set off alarm bells for you and say this is an area where you might think the public is here, but you need to be selling them on this case a bit more.
I think we're pretty much out of time for questions, unless there's anyone who really can't hold it in. Oh, okay.
Okay, it's an easy one. You asked for the first time about AI and security, and a substantial minority said they thought it was a critical threat. I'm just interested in observations as why, what it means for what we might call our digital sovereignty, and if it's related to the US-China technological competition findings as well.
Do you want to talk about AI, Dave? I mean, I think the result you refer to is on the list of threats, where it wasn't up the top of the charts. I mean, Australians are still 46% see AI as a critical threat to Australia's national interests. But I think people are starting to grapple with what does it mean? Where is the opportunity? Where is the threat for us? We asked a similar question last year, and it was about sort of 50-50. So I think it's really a nascent debate in Australia about how AI affects us and enables us to do a whole range of things. But Dave, you've got your head in the tech space as well. So
I mean, I think people look. Artificial intelligence is a huge unknown or uncertainty for a lot of people. I think people don't quite know what it means. I don't either. What it means, how it will disrupt jobs and the workforce. Will it enable us to solve complex and challenging diseases? Is it going to displace a lot of people? Is it going to create sort of military superpowers and capabilities that we can't be mindful of? So I think it's natural for people to feel anxious about it, because I think so many of these things are as yet unknown. And there's this doomsday scenario that artificial intelligence sort of jumps the shark and exceeds the control of humanity, which sensible people seem to think is not a negligible risk. It's not a large risk, but it's not negligible either. So I think it's, I think that's, to my mind, that's quite a sort of sensible assessment of it. I mean, I think we should be curious and enthusiastic about AI, but we shouldn't be, blithely ignoring some of these potential ramifications or risks.
Now, we have spoken a lot about things that can make us feel like we're in the doom and gloom, concerning issues, but I wanted to ask all of our panellists just quickly, what gives you cause for optimism in this report or in global affairs generally?
So very quickly, two things. One is that ability for Australians to grapple with complexity, which we see in our views to the US, our views towards China, as well as how we deal with the problem of climate change and the energy transition. But more specifically on one point that we haven't talked about tonight, which is on foreign aid. 2/3 of the public this year say that we should keep the aid budget. The aid budget is about right or too low, and and 1/3 say it's too high. So the majority are actually in favour of where we are right now, and I think you can't take that for granted in a context where we've seen US aid cut and then big European donors also pull back. It speaks to Australians' internationalist instincts, I think.
One thing that's really remarkable for me is that, in the context of anxiety about the US, over the past 10 or more years, both sides of politics in Australia have invested hugely in our regional relationships. And actually, if you look at our relationship with Japan, with India, with Singapore, with Vietnam, with Indonesia, all of those relationships are arguably actually at their high watermark, not to mention Australia's increased level of focus on the Pacific. And I think regardless of the uncertainty, that will stand us in good stead for what's to come.
Senator?
I think, the level of sophistication, a sophisticated understanding of some of the challenges Australia faces and the dilemmas, I think, is revealed in this poll. I think it's quite reassuring to read it and think, oh yes, Australians get that this is an issue or that this is complicated, or they can hold seemingly contradictory views at the same time, which is kind of part of the art of, international relations and foreign policy. So it makes me think, well, look, we're not, we've got quite a well-informed, well-engaged nation who you can have these sorts of difficult conversations with about policy trade-offs.
Well, we're out of time. We're about 3 minutes over. So if I was hosting my radio show, the new presenter would well be in the chair by now. Thank you to everyone at the Lowy Institute who helped put this panel together, and just a round of applause for our wonderful panel who provided such great insights. And thank you for